Jarvis was the fruition of 2 years of testing what's known as the rig in the box. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about it, but this is the secret of doing 100,000 QSO DXpedition with a 4-hour setup time on a remote island. And we'll get into that as we go through. So everybody knows Jarvis is one of the KHs. It's uninhabited. It's 1.7 square miles. It's in the South Pacific. The reason for going to Jarvis started, we were trying to go to Johnston. And Fish and Wildlife said, well, sure, take a bunch of our biologists and you can go to Johnston. Well, Johnston also is co-managed by the U.S. Air Force. And even though we had Fish and Wildlife, the Air Force said, no, there's plutonium around, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why we didn't want any non-Air Force personnel there. So Fish and Wildlife said, okay, anywhere else you want to go in the Pacific, and we worked with them on getting to Jarvis. Now, like many of the countries in the top 20 that are run by environmental places like Kermadec or ZL9, it's becoming extremely hard to get permission to go there. They've spent years and years getting rid of the mice and getting rid of non-indigenous animals. And so we had to find a way to convince them that we were not going to damage the islands. And this is not just U.S. Fish and Wildlife, it's all over the world. It's a national refuge. It's there to protect the locals. It was discovered in 1821. It was originally in the mid-1850s, taken by the U.S. under the Guano Act, and they were mining guano there, and you can still see the guano pits and the old rail tram lines that took the guano to the water. In the 1930s, the Army took Hawaiians, like 7 to 10, and dropped them on a lot of these islands. You can imagine, as you'll see in the pictures, living there. During the beginning of World War II, there was Baker and Howland. There was people all over the Pacific, young Hawaiian settlers. But even though there were 7 to 10 people on these islands, they were bombed after Pearl Harbor on the way back. And in fact, people lost their lives, young Hawaiians, on these islands. Why did we go? Again, it was rare. We worked for years to get the permission. It was rare, as in number 17, again in the top 20. It was number 9 in Europe. In Western Europe on phone, it was number 2, and it was number 8 on Digi. So it was extremely in demand. It was one of the rarest IOTAs. Now, IOTA has a rule that you have to be on the island. You can't be remote. We weren't going to be on the island, as you'll see. We were doing rig in a box. But because it was so rare, IOTA made an exception. And when IOTA made the exception that we were anchored just offshore, all the antennas, all the radios were on the island, we were still in the Jarvis National Monument on the boat. So they made a rule change. That's what happens when you're real rare. And once IOTA was approved, POTA became also falling in line. And it hadn't been on the air in 30 years. Now, I've been asked this question over and over. You have Desecheo, which is like 5 miles off Puerto Rico. You have 730 kilometers between Palmyra and Jarvis. You have separation of territory by treaty. Kiribati intersects the line between Palmyra and Jarvis. Also, lots of the old islands, Kingman Reef, remember that? Kingman Reef was right next to Palmyra, but it counted because they considered Palmyra a parent of Kingman, and under the rules of islands, you could have one sub. They deleted Kingman Reef. They didn't make Palmyra a sub. And in the very first DXCC list, Palmyra was not even on it. It was Jarvis. And then after the war, nobody knows why, they combined the two of them. Well, we 2 years ago went to the DXAC and said this should count separate. They said no. We appealed it. They met again. And think what it would do to the DXCC program to have a new one. I mean, we're all stuck at the, well, not all, but a lot of people are stuck at the top of the honor roll, and would have made it a lot more interesting. So the rib, you've all heard about the rib. This is what it looks like. I'll describe it in more detail in a little bit. 2018, we went to Baker Island. We had 13 operators. It took 2 days to set up, tents on the beach, latrine on the beach, tons of gear, tons of water. You know what it's like. You just saw V7.3 where you could fly into. You can imagine what you have to do on an uninhabited island. So on the way back, George is saying, this is ridiculous. 3 days in 100-degree weather on the beach, setting up, tearing down. There has to be a better way. Well, why? Tightening U.S. Fish and Wildlife rules and other agencies. When was the last time CE0X was on? Or the FTs, you have to go with the military. ZK3 I mentioned. The cost. Southern Oceans, now we're talking about $1.6 million to take a dozen people to operate. Back 30 years ago, it didn't cost as much, but between the changes of the sizes of the boats and the need to make 100,000 Qs, you know, back in the day, if you made 50,000 Qs, it was a great success. We made 69,000 on Baker and spent 350,000, chartered a boat. DXpeditioners, 5,000 was common 30 years ago. Now you're putting $25,000 to go and take a month out of your life to activate these rare ones. Shipping, tons of gear. Greg mentioned the cost of shipping to Fiji. We left from American Samoa. We luckily had a boat which we could store all the gear. Safety, we're all getting older. Yes, V73WW had a great group of youth on that trip. But the average age of people going to most of these rare islands is rapidly going up. Time's money, as I mentioned, a quarter of the trip on Baker Island, we were setting up, we were tearing down, running rafts over the reef to bring us daily food and supplies. And as I mentioned, the budget for Bouvet is now $1.6 million. So, the rib concept. Build a temperature-controlled radio in a box. They have external fans, they're water-cooled. The rib, the generators, the antennas, all are on the island. The only thing off the island are the people. UHF IP bridges, it's not much different than you operating remote, as most of a lot of DXers are now doing over the internet. We worked from the boat, the remote operators around the world connecting to the radios on the boat. All the control operators were the 5 of us that were on the boat. People did not connect to the radios on the island directly. Once a day, you go top up the generators, you do maintenance, you do inspections, you make sure everything's copacetic. We had a lot of good luck with the radios and the station on the island, and that's because of 2 years of practice. No time wasted, as I said. The local operators took care of going to the island, which you'll see shortly, on a custom-built, what we call the rib boat. Operator endurance. By the time we got set up on Baker, we were exhausted. 100 degrees, no shelter on the islands that we go to. So by the time you get set up, you're exhausted anyway. And when you're exhausted, you make less cues. Minimal environmental impact. As I said, the key to Fish and Wildlife was we weren't going to set up a little tent city and influence what was happening on the island. You never saw a latrine on Jarvis. This is the latrine we used on South Orkney. Not fun. Evolution, as I mentioned, 2018, we tried to do a couple of the radios remote from the boat. The boat rocked, connections weren't such, and with an unreliable link, we didn't do it. So 2 years after Baker, George started playing with better links. We used MIMO antennas. Radios were installed in Pelican cases with the external. The rib advanced in 2021 so that you could connect by phone to the ribs. It wasn't great. Throughput wasn't bad, but it worked. Starlink came into use in 2022, and that was the game changer because of the bandwidth of remote operators to the boat. And in 2023, the magnet took to the water, went in the Pacific. We operated from FO, VP6 Ducey, E51. The month before we went to Jarvis, we had a full-blown DXpedition with 40 remote operators. We tested everything. We had by then we had a trained group of 50 who knew how to do the remotes, and we limited the remotes to CW and FT8 just because of the bandwidth required for sideband. Here's your basic rib configuration. Again, 40 remote operators connecting to the boat over Starlink. The local ops monitoring everything on the magnet, which you see there. 900 megahertz IP bridge back to the ribs on the island. So again, the separation under U.S. rules, and we were governed by that, control operators had to be in charge of the radios at all times when you have foreign operators. So we had a lot of remotes that were U.S. hams, but we still used full control. We were monitoring the remote radios at all time. Here's your basic configuration. We used ribs that had 2 radios in them for all the remote stations. We only had 1 remote station with an amp, 500 watts. Conditions were good. We had great antennas. We really did not need full QRO. We saved that for 160 and 80. We did do some lower power 80 as well on CW. We had 1 standby rib, so we did not have all the radios on. We never needed the backup, what we called local 2. We never needed it because nothing failed. All the time the magnet was in the Pacific, we still did not have our landing permit for Jarvis. As I said, we were originally working on Johnston. The Air Force said no. We were working on Jarvis. We were offering to take more biologists to the island. When we set up on Tiki How and we sent U.S. Fish and Wildlife this picture, they were then convinced that we were not going to do the Baker Island type of DXpedition. No sleeping tents, no human presence, minimum presence, smaller antennas, not a lot of generators because of the lower power. We thought at that time that we were sacrificing the number of Qs we would make with this very limited type presence on the island. That turned out not to be the case. Again, only essentials. And finally, after 3 years of negotiating, we got our landing permit and operating permit that covered both Palmyra and Jarvis, because around Palmyra is fish and wildlife territory. This is the island team. George, AA7JV, sitting over there. Myself, we were the co-leaders. Tommy, who's been with George all over the Pacific years before the RIB concept. Mike K and 4EEI, who will come up here and talk about how you put a DXpedition on the air in 4 hours. And Adrian, everybody knows Adrian, he's sitting in the back there. We had roughly 20 CW remote ops. They're all well-known call signs. They're contesters, DXpeditioners. Jerry Hull, W1VE, who's a master at remote. He was the team leader. I'm sure you know those call signs there. The FT8 team, led by AA7A. Again, all experienced operators. W1UE is in the back. He turned out to be our #1 QSO op, not only in FT8, but in CW. Whenever there was an open spot, Dennis found it, no matter what time of the day. So there were sometimes he was on 2 radios at once. How do you corral 40 operators with a schedule? You know, we all used to go like on Midway, paper boards, chalkboards. Everybody wanted their better slot. When you deal with remote operators, it's not like you can sit down and breakfast and say, who wants to take the 4 a.m. 20-meter shift? It just doesn't happen. So we came up with this shared matrix on Google Drive where we put in which radios did what band. We shaded the areas which bands would be open, because most of the operators were 12 hours away from where we were on Jarvis. And people could choose their slot. The schedule went days in advance. It wasn't a mad dash at turn of the clock at midnight, take your spot. There was plenty of time for everybody. And if you're up at 3 a.m. and you see that there's a slot open, you know which bands will be open, you know which remote radio will be open. And this worked out very well. It was rare that we would see one of the remote stations with nobody operating. And a lot of the Europeans took the slots when Europe would be coming in and what have you. What did a remote operator see? Well, just what you saw at home. AnyDesk would connect to the desktop. You saw the flex radio screen, so you'd know if the SWR was off. The CW operators had 2 instances of N1MM running, where one would be your receive, and you could tune up and down the pileup with a mouse. Worked out very well. This is your FT8 Super Fox screen. You could see the large Q on the left side of the screen. You didn't need to have N1MM open. You only needed the flex radio SDR screen open so you could see that the transmitting was going and the SWR wasn't going crazy. Here are our antennas. Verticals. Verticals work on beaches. The low band verticals were actually down in the water. Tried and true, George has his own tuners. The antenna on the left was our biggest antenna, 45 feet. Again, you don't need 90-foot verticals when you're the DX. And that vertical, I almost said beam, that vertical worked 10 through 160. We also had smaller verticals, folded dipoles. The third from the left is our 6-meter beam. When we convinced Fish and Wildlife we wanted to do verticals, they even made us put the 6-meter beam a vertical. We had midnight local time, almost daily openings to Japan, 3D2, VKs. So we had a presence on 6 meters. That was one of the few instances where the local operators were doing FT8. We did all the sideband with the local operators and 6 meters. And we would turn the antenna. One day it would be faced towards North America, one day it would be faced towards Japan. There were just no North American openings. This is the antenna layout on the beach. Again, you can see 3 of the antennas right down by the water. The HF antennas, the V8s and what have you, were up near what I call the highest part of the island. I mean, 20 feet above sea level at most. And that's where the 6-meter beam. But all the beams that could work on the low bands were down at the very waterline, the high tide waterline in some cases, in the water 24 hours. You see the rib boat there? All the radios were in that immediate proximity. The magnet was built for DXpeditions. It has this great landing platform that had the rib boat and the landing craft up high off the water. It was lowered down into the water for takeoff, no jumping off in most cases to get on the boat. We were not allowed to anchor. There was supposedly an anchor in the coral reef from World War II days. They gave us permission to dive and look for it. It was never found. So the magnet was moving at all times to maintain position. There were 5 local operators, as I mentioned, on the boat, the crew of 4, a captain, and 3 U.S. Fish and Wildlife scientists, which again endeared them to letting us go there. They hadn't been there in a while because of budget constraints, and they wanted to do science, and we took 3 of them. That's what the level of the operating level of the boat looked like. We had a little living room. The picture at the bottom that says N5J, you can see 2 of the remote operating stations. The 160-80 position is where the Maestro's sitting all the way on the left of that picture. And there's a good shot of the island straight ahead. So we weren't far offshore. And there was Local 3 with me operating near the kitchen. Food was great. Part of the crew even cooked. Tommy made a Hungarian goulash down there on the left. I made the New York-style cheesecake up on the right. So there was some fun involved. It wasn't all work. The landing craft. I'm going to have Mike come up and talk about the rib boat and, well, the slides here. And then he'll follow it up with a small video of him driving to the island.
So the rib boat concept is just an easy way to land all this equipment and pretty much have it ready to go as soon as you get ashore. We put a winch on the front of it. I don't know if you could see it there, but that assisted us in bringing up this non-powered wheeled vehicle onto the island. A lot of the stuff that we have set up for it, if you can see along the sides, I have the antenna bases. All of this stuff is velcroed to the side of the rib boat to assist in. Most of these antennas are like 10, 12 sections long. So instead of assembling each antenna section for efficiency, we put the two antenna sections together and made it into 6 sections instead of 12. And that's easy to assemble when you're out there in the heat and the sun. You don't really know what's going on anymore. You're just trying to get it all together. We'll assemble that real quick, and it's all set up in a way that you can easily unstrap it from the rib boat. Each section, each antenna has its own position, and you just take it off of there, run off, set it up, and then the coax comes out, hook it up to the ribs, which the rib boat, or the ribs that are on the boat are already, the generators running, the fuel tanks have fuel in it, and it's all ready to go. You just plug it in and you're on the air. Oh, okay. I don't know if you could see the little picture of me with the gas can there. This is another consideration with Fish and Wildlife and not, having any type of pollution. The way that gas can is set up is that when it's upside down, it has a quick flow valve. And it's usually used for dirt bikes or something, that when you're in a race, you just plunk it onto the dirt bike and it doesn't spill any fuel and transfers 5 gallons pretty quickly. That was a great thing because then we can refill. Fish and Wildlife was real happy. There was no spillage of any kind. And we also have, just in case a fire happens and you're not actually out there on the island, if you look right below me, you'll see the little fire extinguisher ball. It's actually a fire sensitive ball. It has a fuse on it with a kind of an explosive charge inside. You can get them at Home Depot for like $25 or something. And inside of that, it has the fire retardant chemical. And if any fire happens and you're not there, they will explode, put it out. We had fuel containments inside of the rib boat underneath the generators, so it prevents any spillage. Which one? You said spacebar?
Yeah, the video. Okay, the video's not running. Mike's moment of glory. The rib boat had an engine, as I said, drove to the island, everything pre-staged how we wanted it to come off. There's your Fish and Wildlife sign for Jarvis. When we got there, it was totally covered in guano. Mike helped the Fish and Wildlife people clean it off. The island picture you see there, you can still tell where the tram for the guano left. There's a 5-meter day beacon on there. Crabs everywhere in the water, sharks everywhere. George was setting up the 160 vertical along the reef, and the black-tipped sharks would just swim by. They didn't really pay much attention. There was a great hammerhead shark when George was looking for the buried anchor. And the largest colony of sooty terns in the world is on Jarvis, and boy, are they loud. No DXpedition would be complete without pictures of great sunsets. A quick word on Super Fox. When we went to Baker, we were the first team to introduce the world to foxhound. For Jarvis, we worked with Joe Taylor to get better throughput, and we came up with Super Fox. There were no reports of pirates when we were on Jarvis on FT8 because we sent out an encryption that said we were who we were. 106,000 Qs, 43,000 CW Qs, 40-odd thousand FT8 Qs, 2,000 Qs on top band in the middle of August. So when you hear a DXpedition say, we're not going to do top band because it's the summer, we did 2,000 Qs from Baker in July. Seasons are only dead spots because people don't try the bands. How did we do? As I said, we went from a dozen days on an island to a more rare place. We made 100,000 Qs without any infrastructure, meaning people on the island, less gas, less water, less time. I think it speaks for itself. The rib in the box for these rare entities is here. Our sponsors, every DXpedition that was up here today was sponsored by NCDXF, and in every case, they were the lead sponsor, the same with us. Thank you all, from the manufacturers like DX Engineering, Flex, and of course Fish and Wildlife for allowing us to visit their island.